This is Justin Haggard from the Daily Knight. Welcome to our first video production for the platform. This is something that we've been wanting to do for the last year or so, as we've been focused on more printed or more written products for covering U.S. and world news, church news, updates about the counter-revolution against the growth of socialism, communism in this country and around the world. And then insightful commentary and trying to produce authentic and traditional catechesis to inform a lot of people that have not been taught the right teachings of the church, and then to combat modernism, which is our main mission here at the Daily Knight, to defeat modernism, the synthesis of all heresies that Pope St. Pius X correctly coined over 100 years ago. I'd like to start today with a prayer. In nomine Patri, Filii, Spiritus Sancti. Amen. O Christ Jesus, I acknowledge thee to be the King of the universe. All that hath been made is created for thee. Exercise over me all thy sovereign rights. I hereby renew the promises of my baptism, renouncing Satan and all his works and pomps. And I engage myself to lead henceforth a truly Christian life. And in a special manner do I undertake to bring about the triumph of the rights of God in thy church, so far as in me lies. Divine Heart of Jesus, I offer thee my poor actions to obtain the acknowledgement by every heart of thy sacred kingly power. In such wise may the kingdom of thy peace be firmly established throughout all the earth. Amen. In nomine Patri, Filii, Spiritus Sancti. Amen. I come at you on the eve of the 246th anniversary of not the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which a lot of people think that that's when the document was signed on July 4th, 1776, but that was when the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration. The actual Declaration was engrossed on parchment and signed by our founding fathers on August 2nd, 1776. So it has been 246 years. This country has been through a lot. It's been through its ups and downs. I still believe, as someone who has served this country and someone that loves this country very much, that our brightest day is ahead of us. But it's going to take a lot of really great men and women, people of faith, Catholics, to rise up and be moral and ethical leaders in our society, not just in our parish and for our families. That is something that is our duty to do, but to go beyond that and to be a leader in society and start taking back some of our communities that have been overrun by modernists, socialists, communists, and start kicking these people out of our local governments, out of our state governments, and definitely out of Washington, D.C., that has become a government that is outside of the Constitution, that no longer represents the American people, that no longer represents the sovereign states of this country, and is no different than the tyranny that was across the Atlantic Ocean 246 years ago. And that's why I find this to be a very interesting and very applicable topic today, to cover of what it was like for Catholics in the early colonies. What was it like for Catholic leaders that saw a problem in their society, in their colony, and wanted to rise up, join together to make a difference. And who were those individuals? What did they do? How did they look at the situation? I find it very applicable today, and I think it's something that we can definitely learn about as Americans today, and as Catholic men and women who are looking to serve and make this country what it ought to be. And like I said, I don't think we've had our brightest day yet. I don't think we've reached our full potential, but together we can definitely get there. This is also a very somber moment for myself, as a man who a year ago was a political prisoner. I sat actually a year ago, I sat in an 8x8 cell, one pair of clothes, was not given a second pair for over 20-something days, in solitary confinement for quote unquote what was deemed for COVID quarantine, even though that's absolutely erroneous. And the only glimpse outside of that cell that I had, other than going out every other day, so 3 times a week for a 15-minute shower, the only glimpse that I had outside of that cell was a little gap about that big, because I had this stairwell outside my window, and that's kind of what obstructed my view. But I could see about this much. If I really leaned over, I could see across his courtyard, his green grass. I could see some people walking around. I could see the barred fences. And above that, on the building across from the courtyard, there was an American flag. And I looked at that multiple times a day, stared at it sometimes, and that was freedom to me. That was something that I held on to during that time. And I was in there during the 4th of July, and I stared at that flag many times, and swore that when I got out, that I would get right back to work, and trying to make this country American again, because it's not anymore. This is not the country that I was born into. This is not the country that I was raised in. This is not the country that my parents were raised in. This is not the country that my grandparents were raised in. But there's no one that can stop us to make it what it used to be, and to restore our freedoms, and restore freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and the right to defend and bear arms, to protect the sanctity of life. There's a lot of work to be had. There's a lot of great people out there that are working hard, and a lot of prayers, a lot of sacrifices being made. But here on the eve of 4th of July, our Independence Day, I think, like I said, I think it's very prudent to look back 246 years ago, to analyze what it was like for Catholics back then. What does that mean for us today? And to talk about some of the leaders, some of the patriots that we had during that time that were Catholic, and how did they view tyranny? How did they stand in the face of tyranny? And can they be an example for us today? So with the exception of Maryland, but only for a bit, each of the English colonies along the North American coastline despised and feared Roman Catholics as well as Catholicism. It is even documented that even during the Revolution, there would be some New England militiamen that would scream "No King, no Pope" as they ran into battle. Their view of the tyranny that was coming from London, that there was blanket usury to deprive the American the colonists of not just taxes, but their very free market opportunities, to restrict the opportunities in this country just so that they could use it to pay the balances that the Bank of England couldn't cover for the amount of wars and other social programs that Parliament and the King were pushing around the other colonies and their grip on the entire world. And the American colonies were really to bankroll that. It was straight usury of the American worker, the American family, to bankroll the errors and the tyranny of London. And Catholics, just like in Ireland and England, did not have rights. We did not have rights, and not just not being able to serve in government, but being segregated from the rest of society. You had peasants in Ireland that were told what they could grow, because certain crops were reserved for Protestants, where they could grow, what land they could use, where could they raise their families, where could you build your church, what businesses could you work for, because definitely a Protestant, a Presbyterian, or or an Anglican would get a job over you. You couldn't serve in your local police force. You couldn't serve in your local government. You couldn't represent your community in larger government. And the penal laws absolutely subjugated the Catholic population. And a lot of these laws had traveled across the Atlantic Ocean and found home in the colonies. Of the 13 original colonies, only Pennsylvania and Maryland offered anything that we might today recognize as religious toleration. Maryland, for an almost 30-year-long period prior to 1689, might very well have been the most tolerant place in the world when it came to religion. Maryland was a private colony, and because of that, it was able to establish laws and regulations that were absent of the king's bigoted penal laws. And what that allowed was a Catholic community to blossom within that private colony in Maryland. And that's why you have the first seat of an ordinary and really a Catholic presence in Baltimore. That's where we get the Baltimore catechesis from. That's where, if you find old Bibles, Catholic Bibles, Dewey Reams, or if you find old catechisms, not just the Baltimore Catechism, but other prints, a lot of them are signed and approved by the ordinary in Baltimore. So Maryland's got a very rich Catholic history to it. And I didn't fully understand this when I was visiting Maryland, and I went to a small town called St. Mary's. It's down there on one of the peninsulas going into the Chesapeake Bay. And it was one of the original settlements for the colonists coming into Maryland. And there was an old Anglican area and church and settlement. And a little bit up the road, there was a Catholic community. And there was a Jesuit. There was a church, a chapel ran by Jesuits, and there was old buildings around there. The actual chapel is no longer there. I think there was a foundation that was trying to restore it, but the foundation was there. And you could see, and like I said, I didn't know this when I first got there. There was a catacomb kind of crypt in the base of the foundation. It only went down a couple feet, but it was enough where there could be graves. And so you're thinking about some of the first generations of Catholic colonists in the United States that buried their loved ones in that parish. And you're talking about the potential those have gone on and become saints, right? So I think it definitely, if you're in Maryland, it's a little bit of a drive because you have to go around the bay. But if you're in Maryland, check it out, St. Mary's, Maryland, and try to find that old chapel and that old Catholic settlement there. I think it's definitely worth your trouble to drive that way and maybe say a decade for them, for those that are in purgatory. So it was a private colony. That's how they were able to escape the penal laws. To enforce its religious toleration, however, it traded its freedom of speech. Society protected the diversity of religious communities by forbidding blasphemy against the Holy Trinity, mocking of Mary or any of the saints, and referring to any Christian sect by a derogatory name. So what this did was say, hey, we're going to have full tolerance on different Christian denominations and religions, but you have to accept each other. Full tolerance. You can't challenge or speak out against their dogmas and beliefs. And this worked, like I said, but eventually the deed passed back over to the king, and it was no longer a private colony. And so all those laws were essentially wiped away a couple of decades later. When radicals seized the provincial government in 1689, however, they undid all laws of religious toleration, demanding that every resident of Maryland honor the Church of England as the established church of the land. The new government of 1689, which lasted until 1774, for all intents and purposes outlawed Roman Catholicism, double taxing Catholics, forbidding the education of Catholic children, and actually permanently removing children in danger of being raised in a Catholic fashion from their birth parents. And that sounds straight out of the communist playbook. This is what communist revolutionaries did. The Bolsheviks at the early days of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 was ripping children out of the homes of Christians and Eastern Orthodox, those that supported the Tsar and the old regime, that to remove the quote-unquote bigotry of the child was to rip them out of the homes of their parents and put them into the state, that all children were essentially property of the state and should be educated according to the party line. This is no different what they did to some Catholic families and Catholic children in Maryland during those days. The very first resolutions passed by the First Congress, meeting in the fall of 1774 and calling itself the First Continental Congress, were complaints against British tolerance toward and of Canadian Roman Catholics. So at this time, there was a little bit more acceptance for the Catholics in Quebec, to the contrary of Catholics in Ireland, Scotland, and England that were still absolutely segregated and suppressed up into the 20th century. But in Quebec, it was a little different. In particular, Americans feared what the British called the Quebec Act, passed in June of 1774. John Adams, never pro-Catholic, claimed that the Quebec Act was a frightful system, as would have terrified any people who did not prefer liberty to life. So the idea that Britain would have tolerance and full acceptance of Catholics inside of a particular domain, and to give them full religious liberty, that was something that the second president of the United States and a founding father of ours claimed was a frightful system. On October 21st, 1774, Congress issued the following, its first official pronouncement ever. The Quebec Act was passed by Parliament to place in the hands of power to reduce the ancient free Protestant colonies to slavery. The fact that by giving religious freedom to Catholics, that it would be subjecting them to slavery. Nor, it stated, can we suppress our astonishment that a British Parliament should ever consent to establish in that country, i.e. Canada, a religion that has deluged your island with blood and superseded impiety, bigotry, persecution, murder, and rebellions through every part of the world. That is what they had to say about Catholicism. Despite all of the bigotry against Catholics, two of the wealthiest men in America at the time of the signing of the Declaration of Independence were practicing Roman Catholics. The first, an actual signer of the Declaration, was Charles Carroll of Carrollton, a brilliant, patriotic, and Republican Marylander. The other was the chief of the Miami Indians, John Baptiste Richardville, living near what is now Fort Wayne, Indiana. The first individual is who we're going to speak extensively on, because like I said, I think what the leadership that Charles Carroll exemplified, the way that he approached the tyranny out of the usurper in London at the time, living in a society that did not accept Catholic thought and teaching, that is very applicable to today. Charles Carroll was an Irish-American politician, planter, and signatory of the Declaration of Independence. He was the only Catholic signatory and the last surviving signatory of the Declaration of Independence, dying 56 years after signing the document. Considered one of the founding fathers of the United States, Carroll was known contemporaneously as the first citizen of the American colonies, a consequence of signing articles in the Maryland Gazette with that pen name. He served as a delegate to the Continental Congress and Confederation Congress. Carroll later served as the first United States Senator for Maryland. Of all of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, Carroll was reputed to be the wealthiest and most formally educated of the group. A product of his 17-year Jesuit education in France, Carroll spoke 5 languages fluently. Born in Annapolis, Maryland, Carroll inherited vast agricultural estates and was regarded as the wealthiest man in the American colonies when the American Revolution commenced in 1775. His personal fortune at this time was reported to be 2.1 million pounds sterling, the equivalent to $375 million in 2021, so just shy of today's inflation rate. In addition, Carroll presided over his manor in Maryland, a 10,000-acre estate that included approximately 300 enslaved people. This is astonishing for somebody that has part of a family, a recent family that had migrated from Ireland to the colonies, left everything behind, and escaped suppression, bigotry, segregation, the absolute suppression of all personal liberties and freedoms. This is something that many Irish fought rebellions over time and again, dying at the hand of the Protestant English, that restricted their right to provide for their families as best that they saw fit, restricted where they could find employment, what they could grow on their farms and their crops, how they were taxed, where could they worship, that they could not serve or represent themselves, that they couldn't serve in the local constabulary, the local police force, the fire department. They could not protect their own communities but the Protestants could, and the Protestants could mass militia and tyrannize the Catholic population that were segregated in slums and bogs. And this is what Charles Carroll's family escaped. They found refuge in the private colony of Maryland that obviously went south once that was deeded back to the king, and the penal laws had found home into Maryland colonial law. And yet they were still able in a matter of a generation, 2 generations, to amass an immense amount of wealth, to become arguably the wealthiest and most successful man in the colonies. Though he was barred from holding office in Maryland because of his religion, Carroll emerged as a leader of the state's movement for independence. He was a delegate to the Annapolis Convention and was selected as a delegate to the Continental Congress in 1776. He was part of an unsuccessful diplomatic mission, which also included Benjamin Franklin and Samuel Chase, that Congress sent to Quebec in hopes of winning the support of the French Canadians. Carroll eventually served in the Maryland Senate from 1781 to 1800. He was elected as one of Maryland's inaugural representatives in the United States Senate, but resigned from the United States Senate in 1792 after Maryland passed a law barring individuals from simultaneously serving in state and federal office. After retiring from public office, he helped establish the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, so continuing his entrepreneurial and business pursuits. So you have this man that has successfully amassed an immense amount of wealth, owned land, been very prosperous. His family, once it has migrated to the colonies and left the kind of tyranny that they were facing in Ireland under the penal laws and under Parliament and the usurper king in London that was illegally on the throne after removing the Catholic King James II, just because he was Catholic. And they come to Maryland only to have that entire world flipped upside down. The tyranny that they faced in Ireland came to the colonies. The land was deeded back to the king. Those laws were placed back into effect. Catholics could not serve themselves. Carroll is arguably the wealthiest and most successful businessman in the colonies, and yet he can't do anything about it from a political standpoint. He can't run for office and represent himself and his society to make things better, to remove the laws that are hurting so many countless Catholics in Maryland. So what is he to do? He's represented by a government that does not represent him, that is not made up of him, that has not his best interests at heart, and you have laws that restrict the God-given rights that every man and woman and child inherits at birth. And he, Charles Carroll, becomes a voice for the independence, a voice for the revolution, a voice for freedom and liberty, as a writer, and then eventually as an orator and a absolute just leader during the revolution. Carroll was not initially interested in politics, more so business. And in any event, Catholics had been barred from holding office in Maryland since 1704 Act seeking to prevent the growth of popery in this province. But as the dispute between Great Britain and her American colonies intensified in early 1770s, Carroll became a powerful voice for independence. In 1772, engaged in a debate conducted through anonymous newspaper letters maintaining the right of the colonies to control their own taxation. Writing in the Maryland Gazette under the pseudonym First Citizen, he became a prominent spokesman against the governor's proclamation increasing legal fees to state officers and Protestant clergy. In the early 1770s, Carroll appears to have embraced the idea that only violence could break the impasse with Great Britain. According to accounts, Carroll and Samuel Chase, who would also later sign the Declaration of Independence on Maryland's behalf, had the following exchange. Chase asserted that we have the better of our opponents. We have completely written them down. Carroll countered, saying that, and do you think that writing will settle the question between us? Chase had this to say, to be sure, what else can we resort to? Carroll, hearing that and not accepting it, asserted that the bayonet, our argument will only raise the feelings of the people to that pitch, when open war will be looked to as the arbiter of the dispute. Seeing the bigotry and the lack of interest and wherewithal of the government to represent the people of the colonies, specifically Catholics, Carroll had a much different view of how to defend the rights of the men and women of the colony from freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and how to defend those who are defenseless. Carroll is fully aware of the kind of tyranny that Great Britain can deliver on a defenseless people, of the tyranny that was administered so violently in Ireland, that has spent 300 years of spilled 300 years of blood across the Emerald Isle. Knowing that, and knowing that the tyranny would never stop and that it would only manifest into worse and worse violence against the American colonies, those who cannot defend themselves, his answer to that was the bayonet. His answer to that was war to be the arbiter of the dispute. And this is not reaching out violence first. This is a defensive war. This is in American colonies that at the time is mostly agricultural. Yes, it's rising as an economic power and an industrial power, but the empire, the British Empire, is around the globe. The sun never set on the British Empire. Its armada, its army. This is the largest force next to France. This is the largest force in the world. And for a government that doesn't see your interest to represent you and to protect your rights as a citizen, as a human being, there's a lot of risk in that. There's a potential for not just violence, but the absolute depravity of human rights, civil rights, life itself. which eventually would manifest in some of the atrocities that were seen in Boston. But Charles Carroll saw that. He saw what it could become and what it would become. And that's why his answer was so stern, that the bayonet, that war had to be the arbiter of the disputes between the American colonies and the usurper in London. And the Parliament that is and was not interested in representing the interest of the American citizen. Beginning with his election to Maryland's Committee of Correspondence in 1774, Carroll represented the colony in most of the pre-revolutionary groups. He became a member of Annapolis's First Committee of Safety in 1775. Carroll was a delegate to the Annapolis Convention, which functioned as Maryland's revolutionary government before the Declaration of Independence. In early 1776, the Congress sent him on a 4-man diplomatic mission to the province of Quebec in order to seek assistance from French Canadians in the coming confrontation with Great Britain. Carroll was an excellent choice for such a mission, being fluent in French and a Catholic, and therefore well suited to negotiations with the French-speaking Catholics of Quebec. He was joined in the commission by Benjamin Franklin, Samuel Chase, and his cousin John Carroll. The commission did not accomplish its mission, however. Carroll was elected to the Continental Congress on July 4th, 1776, and remained a delegate until 1778. He arrived too late to vote in favor of the Declaration of Independence, but was present to sign the official document that survives today. After both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died on July 4th, 1826, Carroll became the last living signatory of the Declaration of Independence. His signature, however, has a very, very interesting story to it. There were other Charles Carrolls in the Maryland area, in the colonies, and so the fact that he signed it the way he did shows a lot about his character. And he was even confronted about it in public on the floor of the Continental Congress. When it was Carroll's turn to sign the Declaration of Independence, he rose, he went to John Hancock's desk where the document rested, signed his name, Charles Carroll, and returned to his seat. At this point, another member of the Continental Congress who was prejudiced against Carroll because of his Catholicism commented that Carroll risked nothing in signing the document, as there must be many men named Charles Carroll in the colonies, and so the king would be unlikely to order Carroll's arrest without clear proof that he was the same Charles Carroll who had signed the Declaration. And that's a fair point. The idea that as soon as you sign that document, you're signing your death warrant. You're going to be hung or worse. And so your land, your property, your wealth, that doesn't even matter. Your life is at stake. Everything you stood for. I mean, these men, these are not politicians. Most of them were businessmen, landed gentry, those who served in war, those who served their country, those that are men of letters, well, some educated, some personally educated, but all of them very successful, very big leaders in their local society, in their local colonies, and businessmen and well accepted. So the idea that they would lead the revolution, that they would sign their name, that if this went south, their life would be forfeit. And so it was a fair point, however bigoted, attacking him for his Catholicism. But Carroll reacted accordingly, and it shows a lot to his character. After he was confronted, Carroll immediately returned to Hancock's desk, seized the pen again, and added "of Carrollton" to his name, showing without a doubt, this is I. This is who I am. This is my name. I'm putting my name down. I am leading and connecting myself to the success, to the failure and or the success of the revolution for the independence of these United States of America. And, he not only was he a leader in that and representing Maryland at the Continental Congress and signing the Declaration of Independence, and eventually becoming a United States Senator. He served on the Board of War. He also gave considerable financial support to the American Revolution in supporting the Continental Army for their supply chain and resources that they needed to fund the war. This is something that Charles Carroll is extremely commendable for. He risked everything to create the country, to give her the independence that we are celebrating today, that I hear fireworks right now celebrating the 246th birthday of these United States of America. And it is to men like Charles Carroll that we owe so much for. And as a Catholic, I hope and pray that you all add him to your rosary tonight, tomorrow, this week. Keep him in your prayers, and pray that he is welcomed home, and thank him, much thanksgiving for what he and others have given to us, risking everything to give us the kinds of rights and freedoms that we have today. And that leads us to today. How is this applicable to today? We face, like he did, we face injustices from the federal government. We face a federal government that no longer views the Constitution as a document that stands the test of time, that is written the way it is written, it is applied the way it is written. It is not a living document. It cannot change with the times. It cannot have statutes that meant something 200 years ago that today mean something different and that are applied in different ways. That is not justice. That is not freedom. That is not a system that can stand the test of time, and that is not a system that will protect the inherent rights of every living American across this country. The federal government today no longer represents the American people. It does not represent the states. It does not represent the Constitution itself. It might as well be across the Atlantic Ocean. The government in Washington, D.C. is outside of the U.S. Constitution. It was not elected by the people. It was not constitutionally confirmed as a legitimate government. And because of that, it does not respect the rule of law in this country. It only tries to upset the status quo. It deteriorates our economy to increase the anti-American fervor that is growing amongst the inner cities and various circles of colleges and liberal societies. Their goal is to spark revolution from the ground up, or revolution from the top down. Revolution that their government in D.C. can manipulate and law, regulations, tighten and increase power where they can, and then use the Federal Reserve and the banks and big business to build an entire structure that leaves the American people outside of it. Every time that the government has fabricated inflation, it has done this. It has created deteriorating economic conditions for them to increase power, to allow big business and big banks on behalf of the Fed to have the kind of cash to add more to their assets, buy more businesses, buy land. That's why housing prices have gone up so much in the last 2 years. You had big banks that accounted for over a quarter of residential mortgage purchases. So you have this incursion of the federal government and the entities that live off of the money and power of the federal government or support the federal government, vice versa, that are literally standing on the throat of the American people. And you have those in DC that only have one goal in mind, is to gain more power themselves by inciting violence in the streets, inciting Antifa and BLM and other organizations to burn our cities and to attack our churches. I mean, over 40 churches have burned in the last 2 years between the United States and Canada. You have the same kind of movements of communist revolutionaries that are hitting our inner cities and terrorizing Christians and conservatives, as you saw in Spain in the 30s, Germany in the teens and 20s, Russia after 1917, etc. We've seen this again. We've seen this before. This is not new. This is not a new tactic. This is not a new tyranny. This tyranny goes all the way back to the French Revolution and even the Protestant Reformation. This is mob rule. This is violence to get what you want, while the elites are sitting in their soft cushioned areas, playing checkers or chess with the entire board, right? Like they've printed enough money where they have so much liquidity that they have unlimited options to execute on, while they drive the economy into the ground and open up opportunities for themselves. And they create political conditions that allow them to seize power and create more government agencies and create geopolitical issues between Russia and Ukraine, propping up NATO, just so that they can continue to unsettle international economies and cause rapid inflation across the world. Other countries just like us, Turkey has hit 70% inflation rate. There is rampant issues across the world, and this is going to end. This is going to end very poorly. Between World War I and World War II throughout the 20s, the United States Federal Reserve doubled the money supply around the world, and that caused the 1929 crash and a Great Depression that was aimed to create revolutions. It was aimed and designed to centralize power among central banks and federal governments, and create that kind of utopian one world kind of society that we found in the United Nations, that was built right off of the Soviet Union's constitution. So this is the same play. This is just a different generation, but these people, these socialists, these modernists, these communists, it's the same play over and over again on how to gain more power and how to use violence to push the revolution along. And this is just another era. This is another chapter in the history books that we're living. But we need Charles Carrolls. We need men who are patriots, that love their country, that love freedom and liberty, that love their church, that are willing to die not just for her, but for everything that she stands for authentic, traditional, Catholic moral and ethical teachings, that what the foundations of Western society, the foundations that created the greatest civilizations in world history, that created opportunity for millions and millions of men and women and children to prosper. And it is through tyranny and the usurping of opportunity and prosperity that these modernists, these socialists and communists aim to tear everything down for their own gain. And that's something that must be stopped. And that's something that men, like I said, men like Charles Carroll and his contemporaries stood up in the face of tyranny, to say no, and to not just declare independence from that, to establish a government based off of inherent freedoms from God, but to go all the way to use the bayonet and war to be the arbiter, to settle their differences between a government in London that didn't represent them and themselves, that knew their best interests and wanted to protect their families and their future families, all the way to us today, 246 years later. So again, happy Independence Day for everybody listening, and for those outside the United States that are watching this video. I hope you read and understand what this country's gone through, what Catholics 246 years ago have gone through, and what they continue to go through, and the troubles that this country is facing, because this is a trouble that the entire world's facing. We've been living in a modernist world for over 100 years, and the battle and the war is not over. And it's up to us Catholics, as we've saw with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, us Catholics can make a difference. Us Catholics can turn the ship around. Us Catholics, with the help of God, can calm the stormy waters and point the ship back on the right course. And that's something that we ought to do. That's something that we must do. And if not, then at least we die trying. And we owe that. We owe every generation that's come before us, those that are looking down from heaven, that are saints. We owe our children. We owe our future children. We owe our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and every lineage of our posterity from that end. We owe it to them to stand up and fight, to be men of letters, to argue, to debate, to represent Catholic teaching and moral and ethics, to represent divine truth, to defend Holy Mother Church, to defend Western civilization, to defend Christianity, to defend our Lord Jesus Christ, to defend Our Lady, His Mother, to defend God and the Holy Trinity, to defend everything that is good and truthful in this world, and to die trying. That's what it means to be Catholic, and that's what it means to be an American. And I hope that everybody has a safe Independence Day tomorrow. Happy 4th of July, and God bless you. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen.